Okay, hello everybody. Jacek Bartosiak is speaking with me. We have Myers and Albert Świdziński, Strategy&Future team, and tonight we will be discussing the. Basically, we will try to answer the question whether the war in Ukraine has either validated or invalidated the assumptions and the conclusions that we presented in our Poland's new model army concept. Hi, Nick. Hi, Albert.
Good evening, guys.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm fine, except for the fact that it's very late, but this is, time of war. We are all very busy. But, just for our audience we need to dive a little bit more into detail. 3 weeks prior to the, initiation of hostilities in Ukraine, Strategy&Future presented a report called Poland's New Model Army that advocated for a major transformation of the Polish military towards a force that would be capable, in our opinion, to fight the modern warfare, including both pre-kinetic and kinetic, strike reconnaissance complex, all other things of maneuver warfare, many other modern elements of which we might talk. And now we have war in Ukraine. We also went to the United States to promote the idea that we were presenting. And right after we returned from the States, we have the war in Ukraine. And after almost 2 weeks of war, we are recording this on March the 8th, very late evening. We will be bold enough to try to check what was invalidated and what was invalidated. So, Nick, maybe you would start. So, what is your initial, assessment? What elements would you say that were invalidated or validated, or what would be your answer?
So you say we're going to dare to have some answers. I'm going to start by putting some prevarication on the whole thing. The way that the Russians have been fighting in Ukraine so far does not look, in my expectation, like how the Russians would be fighting NATO or even just Poland if they were able to separate Poland from the remainder of NATO somehow. To a large extent, especially at the early phases of the war, we saw a lot of forces that should not really be frontline forces acting in the front line in Ukraine. And so to a certain extent, we should assume that the fighting that we've seen so far is representative more of the not the best that the Russians have to offer. That is changing now, so we might get some additional lessons in the near future. But with that caveat aside, there's a couple of points that I think have been clearly validated and a number of points that there's really not conclusive evidence yet. So perhaps the most important one is this notion of, can the harassment zone properly turn the tide of an operation? And I look forward to hearing Albert say why he thinks I'm completely wrong. But what we've seen so far is that when the Russians manage to break through on fronts where they've done some large-scale movement, especially the Sumy front and some areas in the south, especially going northeast and northwest of Kherson, Zaporozhye in particular, the Russians rapidly got ahead of their supply line, and it took, on average, about 36 to 72 hours for the logistics to catch up. And during that time, Ukrainian units that had been surrounded, and some of them were very small, managed to pull off a lot of substantial casualties against the Russian forward positions, to the point that even after the logistics caught up, Russian movements have been quite slow and really only able to move into uncontested spaces. It's important that they were able to continue moving forward, but even now, after about nearly a week being in near position to attack Kyiv from the northeast, we still haven't seen major battles breaking out in Yabrovary because the Russians simply cannot get enough forces to the front. It seems to have changed in the last 24 hours, but still, that's the first thing I would say has been validated. Would you agree, Albert, or do you think I'm being
before Albert, jumps to start answering you, the Polish war theater is also a little bit different. The battlefield is tighter. If an approaches to Warsaw are easier on one hand, but also the operational axes are more predictable, and I think the Ukrainians were having more difficult time to prepare themselves, so to speak, than we could have if we were prudent enough. Having said that, I think that we would have it much easier to harass the convoys and supply lines than the Ukrainians had, so to speak, and we could attrit the forces in the kill zone that would be gathering to attack Warsaw or try to eliminate our forces closer to Warsaw. I think so. So the terrain is even favoring Poland in that respect, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, pardon me. Look, all I can say is, especially starting from a very broad, very large picture, I think the way Russians wanted this operation to work, essentially with airborne assault in Kiev and hopes of essentially conquering Kiev or decapitating the leadership. And I think essentially this also proves an underlying assumption behind the New Model Army. Very clearly, Russians were hoping for a quick operation and a show of professionalism and capability, which would then cause a cascading effect of demoralization in the Polish or in the Ukrainian armed force and in the society, breaking the will to fight, and essentially both ending the kinetic campaign and making sure that insurgency doesn't pop up following the end of that campaign. So I think that in its own right, proves the basic assumption behind the war correct. It's also very interesting to note what Jarosław Kaczynski pointed out a while ago, stating that, and we agree, again, I think we all concur, that had the Ukrainians been unable to fight back effectively, there would be sanctions, but they would be far more lax, and they would probably end sooner. And it was obvious from since we're doing a recap, I would like to point out that the sanctions really kicked in, the Western sanctions really kicked in around Saturday. Friday it was talk about SWIFT, but there were no decisions being made. So those heavy sanctions, and they truly are heavy. That's probably not a topic for this discussion, but they are pretty heavy, especially the central bank ones, were only imposed while it became clear that Russians are not scoring an immediate and impressive victory. Only then, and this is what we always underscored in New Model Army, right? That we have to stand firm on the escalation ladder, be able to push back and survive on our own, to hope for to catalyze Western reaction. I think this is the essential thing that we've proven correct. There are many ways that we could discuss later. I think the things that didn't work out for us or are questionable whether they worked out insofar as our model is concerned when we applied to Ukraine.
But let's move sector by sector, Albert.
Yeah.
Let's move thing by thing.
Absolutely. It won't be like a washing list, laundry list. Just a quick point that the things that didn't work out, many of them that we thought that would, are also because the Russians did such a horrible job and acted so much out of character when conducting this operation, which isn't something really could account for.
Yeah, but to justify the Russians and try to sort of blur the picture, also the Russians so far did not deploy the real BTG maneuvers, right? They were trying to envelop Kiev with some reconnaissance units, like some sort of a dispersed mode. So it's so difficult to estimate their combat capabilities, so to speak. So it's so difficult to say how that would work against Poland. And for sure, the Russians, as Nick rightly pointed, would be fighting in a different way, I guess, right? So because this was a political decision to do it like that, not to sort of antagonize the society,
It's also been important to note that the civilian government leadership of the various oblasts and a variety of the city councils have been at the forefront of distributing this information. So that even though most of the hardcore tactical knowledge that we are gaining about, operational level knowledge that we are gaining about the campaign is coming from the Ukrainian general staff and a variety of the other central institutions in Kyiv, a lot of the best information is coming from the local regions, from ordinary politicians, to be honest. So that's something that we definitely need to think about improving that basic skill set for local government in Poland as well.
I mean, that reaction, the information domain, was, I think, a bit of a wild card, because I really don't think this was coming top down. It really looks like it was bottom up and grassroots effort that yielded beautiful results. I'm not even sure if you could really prepare people top down for this kind of operation. So it's an interesting thing, because I think the theme that repeats itself when we look at Ukraine is that it isn't really the state that defends the nation, it's the nation, the people that defend the state and are able, and especially in infantry, they've been able to navigate beautifully. But again, the problem is how to actually make it work as a framework and not as a spontaneous effort.
Yeah, also, if we think about information warfare, let's take a look at on the flip side of it. In terms of how it services OODA loop, communication and reconnaissance of the Ukrainian army, and it seems to work also very well. Of course, probably it is being delivered by NATO and JSTAR and stuff, the US, but still, it all seems that the Ukrainians know where the Russians are in this huge dispersed battlefield, because Ukraine is the largest country in Europe in terms of territory. So you can imagine that the troops are looking for each other all the time in this huge battlefield. So who has the better access to, and faster and more competent access to information where the enemy is? You can distribute forces, acting along the internal lines of communication. And it seems that the Ukrainians are holding it for, I don't know what, and this also validates our concept that OODA loop is the most important element of the force and situational awareness. In this case, it is being provided by the US, allegedly, probably, supposedly. We of course propose that we, Polish new model force, new model army, has it on its own, so to speak. But still, this is a critical element. Any thoughts on that, guys?
Yeah, another dimension to this that we've seen speculation on, again, since we don't really have too much access to the frontline information yet, we can't rule on this, but it appears that cyber and electronic warfare fighting has been pretty limited based on what we would have expected from Russian exercises in advance. And it appears to be because Ukraine is such a large country with many different axes being managed and not the greatest of forces at the front line, that the Russians seem to have, calculated that using these systems would have made as many problems for their own command and control as it would have caused for the Ukrainians as well. So invest with that assumption, since Poland is not going to be the one on the attack with the new model army is being used, investing in sensors is certainly going to be honestly more helpful than I was anticipating when we were first coming up with this report, since the utility of disrupting them is going to be fairly limited relative to the Russians maintaining control of the offensive.
Yeah, also speaking about electronic warfare or electromagnetic warfare, and also, putting a few words about air defense, it seems that the Russians are not very proficient at establishing, the defensive perimeter while on march, an offensive posture. Yeah. So both in electronics, because it disturbs their own communication, and also air defense, because it's very difficult to deliver a multi-layered capabilities when you're on the move, right? And
now here's something that the Russians were experimenting with in the last couple of years of exercises. But the thing is, I don't think that has widely distributed as a skill set yet. Would expect that professional forces at the front of an attack on Poland would be knowledgeable, at least much more knowledgeable about how to echelon with some set of defenses. But it is true that it has been remarkably absent in Ukraine.
Yeah.
One brief point to return to information warfare before we move on, though we can all agree that the Ukrainians have definitely seized the high ground on the information warfare domain and have not done anything escalatory, or at least perceived as escalatory, anywhere in Europe, which has kept NATO completely in line. This is still not translated into actual military support beyond just shipping more weapons into the country. Now, Poland being a NATO member is in a different situation at large, but I think that we are still seeing a very hard limit to what some NATO members are willing to do at this point. Whether or not that would hold in a NATO circumstance, and whether or not the fact that Putin's now clearly coming up with increasingly ridiculous means to interact on the diplomatic stage might mean that the threshold is lower in the future is a separate debate, but still, there's a glass ceiling has not been broken there.
I mean, I think if I could interject, I think one thing that the Ukrainians did manage to achieve is they've managed to achieve making sure that there aren't too many calls or pressures on Ukrainian side to negotiate or to terminate conflict at suboptimal conditions for them. And this is, again, a function of the, resilience and, pushback that the Russians, were given, but also the information domain was very important. I mean, you remember the words of the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, who, in his own words, when he spoke, he described his conversation with the German politicians. And basically, they said it doesn't make any sense to ship weapons to Ukraine because this will just essentially prolong their suffering. That was the line of arguments that the Germans provided. And, the ability of Ukrainians to really dominate the infosphere, which is stunning and super unexpected, like so many things in this conflict. I think it guaranteed that they won't be pressured into a very suboptimal, armistice. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is another point, is that it does appear that the Ukrainians are resisting U.S. efforts to possibly mediate this, find some sort of solution, starting with Zelensky refusing to take the evacuation offer when it did look like Kyiv was in a mortal danger in the early phases. So,
and that's in line.
Think that's something
That's such a crucial moment too, because this act itself, I don't know, maybe I'm overstating that this act itself, but basically this cemented, this basically meant that even if Russians win the kinetic phase, they would have to kill him or, put him into jail or whatever. And that in turn means that they will be facing a multi-year insurgency in Ukraine, sapping them away. This one fact that Zelensky didn't run, didn't surrender, didn't agree to humiliating conditions. Very important moment.
Yeah, and this is why during the presentation for our English-speaking audience to know we stress the importance of the Polish government to staying in Warsaw and defending the country, as opposed to what happened in September 1939. So this is critically important because morale is collapsing quickly in the era of social media and culture of videos and photos sent over and across the world via mobile phones. So this is critically important to manage the morale element in your both society and the military, and the Ukrainians are really controlling it, or at least conveying this picture of controlling it, which is really great. And that, I think this galvanized the support for the Ukrainian cause across the Western world. So that's a critical element, both domestically and internationally, that I think we underlined, but it's never, it's never too little, too much it's never too much to underline it all the time. So, but let's focus on other domains. What do you think about air battle? What validated and what invalidated our assumptions?
So I think the air war, and to a slightly lesser extent, the maritime war, have been the hardest to make a larger finding on in this conflict, because the Russians so clearly were reserving their air force for what if NATO decides to come at us kinetically. So what has emerged over time since it's become more or less clear that NATO is not going to do anything, at least in the short term, has been that the Russians are doing a lot more airstrikes, but with gravity bombs and with other not especially sophisticated things, or else fire and forget, but not precision air-launched cruise missiles most of the time. And because Ukraine is such a large country with so many different operational airfields to target, even if they are just recovery fields the Soviets built decades ago, it's been almost impossible for them to suppress absolutely every single air base there is, despite the fact that the Ukrainian Air Force is wildly out of date. But again, it's hard to say that would be something that would be used against Poland, because it's long been understood in Russia that air power is the one thing that NATO, the one conventional aspect which NATO clearly has superiority over Russia. And there's not much the Russians would ever be able to do with it, even with the army they had prior to this invasion.
Yeah, what I would add is that the strike reconnaissance complex of Russia doesn't do the job by itself. It doesn't compel to the behavior. How many, like 600 missiles were shot? And I think it didn't make too much of the impression on the Ukrainians, yeah?
Not really.
Not really. So with passive measures, dispersion, you can really swallow it.
It may have an impact going forward with ammunition supplies, but it hasn't in 11 days or 12 days of war now. Though I think Ukraine, like most militaries, is equipped to fight basically a month of high intensity warfare. So we will see before long what happens on that front. But at least in terms of the initial gambit, I agree that was not an effective way to do anything, at least in conjunction with maneuver warfare.
Yeah. Of course, another thing is that, on the other hand, the air defense that would be assisting the ground troops is critically important, because the Russians have obtained the at least localized air dominance, and can, with impunity, almost impunity, strike troops, unless they fly too low, right? Which they are subject to manpads. So in places where there is still an active air defense of Ukrainians, the Russians are losing aircraft. So it's critically important in key sectors of the kill zone, and in case of our proposition for Poland, to really have this air defense. but it doesn't have to be a long range stuff, right? To shoot the missiles. It's all about aviation. Do you agree with this?
And this has been something that's emerging as a problem now, is that the Ukrainian S-300s have been acting fairly well for the high altitude air defense, but they're running out of missiles. They haven't run out yet, and they should be proud of what they brought down already. But if you're exclusively reliant on these high altitude air defense, you're going to shoot off everything you can afford relatively quick, especially if the Russians come at you much more intensely than they have against the Ukrainians so far.
Yeah.
So yeah, short range air defense is critical. We've seen that proven over and over again with how many attack helicopters just flying over everything. But again, in the absence of doing proper combined arms, which the Russians for some reason are not doing, I don't think we know just how lethal Russia could be if it were actively trying to coordinate all the steps. The only thing we've seen on the purely tactical front is bombing of cities, which is not hard to do. You can do it with anything. And then a bunch of continuous strikes against the Chernihiv area and the Donbass front, which have not produced significant tactical effects just because they consistently got planes in the air.
Yeah, also in terms of the planes, it seems that Russians don't have, at least they don't demonstrate the sophisticated standoff capabilities to bomb in a standoffish manner, to bomb the ground troops. So this is a major takeout from this campaign, right?
I mean, we don't know how their stocks look, actually. I think they have more than we think. They just save them up, or at least that's the, I think, running idea, right? That it's that they're saving them up for in case there's confederation with NATO. And
this actually is where I would blend briefly into what I have to say about the naval dimension of this war, is that we have seen a lot of caliber missiles shot. And what I think that proves is that Russia doesn't think that caliber is very important for fighting NATO. These are quite useful for firing for expeditionary conflicts or for shooting just long distances into Ukraine with ships that are probably not going to be needed if suddenly NATO intervenes. So in that sense, the standoff long-range precision air-launched cruise missiles that Russia has are more or less untested from my perspective in this conflict. We've seen a couple of them, but really not that many. The first instance of it was, I believe, either yesterday or the day before morning when supposedly Russian long-range aviation started shooting missiles at the Vinnytsia air base. But that whether or not that's a new transition in this conflict or just a fluke moment, we don't know yet. But we have seen no shortage of caliber being fired off.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because I'm really no expert in either, air defense or air operations. But I think another takeout is in connecting this, fairly wide use of calibers, and what we thought about air defense. And that we placed on emphasis on short-range air defense rather than systems such as Patriot. I think this is another important takeaway here, because just the sheer number of targets that the Russians had entered to service, and still their operations were fairly limited, right? We were thinking they would take 2 days or more. I think this fairly conclusively proves that it is futile to try to intercept those missiles via air defense systems such as Patriot. And I think
Pantsir performed very poorly this whole campaign.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen the pictures of them burning, but it proves the futility of the idea that we could actually defend, how Russians, or usually how you think about Russian escalation management, and hits against the key civilian infrastructure or important heritage sites or whatever. The idea that we could defend from that via air defense, such as Patriot, is just folly. And I think it also sends a bad signal to both the society and the opponent, because it sends it makes the society believe that this war could be won without casualties and without incurring pain. And we saw that pain tolerance is one thing that Ukrainians have that, allows them to stay in this conflict. And it also sends a bad signal to the opponent, because it shows we're vulnerable this idea. And as we can see in Ukraine, you don't win those wars in a clean way. You really have to get to the nitty-gritty. And so again, Shorad is key, and I think it's still our idea still stands that Patriot is secondary to Shorad.
Then, just to close this off, unless somebody else has something magical to say about the naval dimension, we did see yesterday that basically random rocket fire from Odessa seems to have sunk a brand new Russian patrol boat with quite a lot of missile firepower on it. This isn't like remaking the world in as much as we know that navies are especially fragile and that you sink a ship and loses all of its capabilities. But I think it just emphasizes that from Russia's perspective, the naval dimension of a war in Europe is very limited and something that needs to be preserved far off. So I think this hammers home a point that we've had for pretty much from the beginning of us thinking about the new model army, that the Navy is a very, very secondary priority for Polish.
Yeah, and it's very difficult to assault the fort from the sea. Yeah. So, and especially if the fort is not in the sailing age with cannons, but a precision munition, with ODA Loop and J-Star and whatever, or at least a cruise missile against you. So this is highly, highly prohibitive environment just to come closer to shore and survive.
Yeah. Also, I know it's a cheap shot, but let's remember what happened. I mean, the reasons why it happened are different, but what happened to the Hetman Zaharichny, didn't really play much of a role in the conflict, I think.
I mean, because the naval engagements are very short and brutal, and who has an upper hand is winning. So sometimes people decide to scuttle, by their own crews are simply demolishing the ship. And you cannot outflank the guy. The engagement is direct. Who starts faster is winning. Who gives the first salvo is winning. This is a ruthless nature of the maritime war. So basically, as simple. And if you cannot change this parameter by extending the battlefield to the shore and creating stealthiness by having batteries on the shore or aviation in the air and extending the maritime battlefield, you're doomed. In terms of the surface combatants, if you're inferior in numbers and power and fire. So what about then the ground domain? The cream of the cream of this campaign. What conclusions do we have? What observations do we have compared to the Poland's new model army?
So the most important observation we've seen so far is something that I think Poland already does moderately well, though we have some recommendations about how to improve it. But the Russian absence of combined arms movement has been killing their individual movements. So the Ukrainians will come out and say, "Oh, we won 3 different battles against the Russians today," and they're not lying about it. It's just that those 3 different battles are basically 4 tanks coming at 3 different times a day, easy to cut off and just destroy because they weren't supported by infantry or by anything else around them, or vice versa, infantry moving without tank cover. So you need to be able to make sure that your arms are combined. I don't think that's a revolutionary thought in the Polish armed forces, but I would emphasize again, as we did in the original report, that this means that air defense needs to be integrated into how Poland just moves troops about. Polish forces are quite good at moving their mechanized and armored forces in conjunction with artillery. I've been kind of surprised the Russians not being able to do that especially well so far. But air defense is also important under the assumption that anything might happen and probably will in super high intensity Russia versus NATO conflict.
Yeah. What I would, not invalidate it, but sort of correct certain assumptions in this harassment zone, the light infantry tactical engagements. I would really now provide more ATGMs, as the Ukrainian case shows, not only UAVs and some sporadic ATGMs, but densely distributed ATGMs in huge numbers, just to waste them, huge numbers. But also I would provide the ATGM that the Ukrainians don't have, like, that could engage the enemy tank at 25 kilometers with some soft operators close, which is like this, there are a few cases of such equipment across the world. And that would extend the battlefield and to control all the approaches to major cities in that respect, Yeah.
And we need to emphasize here, we're in big ATGMs.
Yeah.
Oh, it's only been junk going into Ukraine so far, but that does not mean that Carl Gustav counts as a weapon for ATGM distribution, as much as I know it's fun to shoot. So we have seen even just random Ukrainian soft guys out there playing with ATGMs, taking out tanks out of the back and beyond. It's not been their main function, but they've been able to do that among other things. We need to distribute those anti-tank guided weapons throughout all the different distribution depots we've got inside the harassment zones, that anybody can pick them up and use them. But they need to be at least big enough to do not front attack, but side attack on a T-90, considering all the upgrades that are going on. T-90 or the T-72B3M, considering all the upgrades that the Russians are making to their armor systems.
Yeah. So, this model is the Spike or another, type that has a extended range of 25 kilometers is completely you cannot defend against it. If you have the spotting man, spotter, that is targeting the guy, you shoot to one place, and in distributed network battlefield, you can knock out the tank.
We're now starting to see videos of very small groups of Ukrainian soldiers, perhaps maybe 6 at most, doing these spotting, shoot, scoot.
Exactly, and this is called
have a truck. They're just running around in a large battlefield, and since the space is so open that they can pretty much prey on them since they know the truth.
So the Ukrainians call it Mosquito Tactics. I was told by the Turks like 3 hours ago, because I talked to them about it. They already had been talking to Ukrainians, and they call it Mosquito Tactics. So in small units in dispersed battlefield, they use vehicles, they move quickly in transportation, and they shoot, they run again, and they have a very good communication between teams. So this is how it works. And you can really, for example, you arrive, you shoot 7 times, you hit 1 or 2 targets, they are burning, and the column is stopping because they don't know what's going on. Okay, they communicate. There is a very vertical echelon of line of command in Russian. So before it reaches the top guy, it takes time. So everything stops. They don't move, but still they burn the fuel by running the engines. Logistics. Problems are sort of summing up. And here and there, every 5 kilometers, so forth. Yeah.
I mean, if we saw a lot of good harassing tactics, but I think it's interesting that we haven't seen more from Ukrainians. I think that more could have been done. They obviously don't have so many loitering munitions, but I'm surprised we haven't seen many IEDs, for example. This is something that probably, if there is a insurgency, this thing will pop up. Or having shape charges in, how do you call those, sewage canals, or rather the covers for sewers, this sort of thing. So that unconventional warfare element, I think there is still elements that we could still see happening. But for example, the fact that we, I assume, and again, we go back to new model army and our argument that the forces should be training and living and spending as much time as possible in places when they would be in their engagement zones. Doing effective, ambushes really requires you to know the terrain and know the local population. So again, I think this fully confirms, this is one thing that is also fully confirmed by how the conflict went so far.
The other rule that I think we've also seen, something I referred to at the beginning, is that 36 to 72 hour period of logistics restoration. That means that when the Russians are entering into the kill zone, they need to be hit ideally within 36 hours of showing up. regardless of where your forces are at the start of the conflict. So the readiness needs to be at that point at all times.
Yeah.
And that may not be especially difficult to do where you just call everybody back to readiness within about 18 to 24 hours, and then just be in position within an additional 12. If you have things not terribly far from where the engagement zone is going to be, that's not too hard to do. And also, if the Russians are attacking quite rapidly in order to try to get a shock through maneuver effect, they cannot deviate very far from the roads without accumulating more logistics challenges. So Ukraine right now, everybody's been talking about all the massive mud that is a big problem in that part of the world. And it is a big problem, but Russian equipment is sort of specialized to deal with that. So I don't think that is as decisive a factor as what's been going on. But in Poland, where there's a lot of forests on the eastern side of the country where they'll be driving through, going off roads a lot harder than it is even in Ukraine. And so you know basically where they're going to go. You just need to be in position and ready to start intercepting at the various points with your heavy units very fast.
That is true. So, yeah. And have we, encountered any reports on mechanized, battles, mech against mech, tank against tank? Do we have I asked this question to the Turkish friends who are monitoring everything, and they say that scarcely, maybe around Kherson or somewhere, and maybe in Chernihiv, but there are no reports from this region, But basically, it's light infantry tactics, So I don't know. And in Poland, there is a fierce debate between, lovers of mech and the lovers of light infantry, and there are two camps, and we don't know the truth. So what is your guess, guys?
I'm inclined to agree with the Turkish observer you're mentioning there. I've seen almost nothing. I do think that if it's happening primarily in the Chernigov area, which we just are not getting on the ground tactical data from, and for good reason. Either the Russians or the Ukrainians are going to want to share that in the middle of the battle. But it does not look like there has been very much of this tank on tank or even BMP on BMP fighting to this point. The confrontations we have generally seen are artillery versus tank, light infantry sabotage versus tank, whether that's Molotov cocktail or whatnot, and then ATGM versus tank or UAV versus tank. I'm also kind of surprised how little we've seen of shooting up BMPs. We usually just see the video of the BMP afterward with the guys pulling out of it. I have noticed, I'd be interested to hear if you've seen this also, that there's been a changing proportion over the course of the war of what was clearly a precision shot from a UAV, an ATGM, or some other light infantry-based thing against armored vehicles versus artillery shots where the whole area is burnt out. Some days it appears that there's lots of one, some days it appears to be lots of the other. I suspect that has more to do with the degree of movement that has been going around on that particular day. But those are the types of battles that I've been seeing the aftermaths of so far.
What do you think about the, VDV air assault troops and apparent, failures of air assault troops to seize and hold primarily the main places, with a spectacular loss of the full regiment, according to reports, and on this airfield to the northwest of the Ukrainian capital,
possibly a whole regiment.
Yeah,
I mean, the big thing with the VDV's failures of this thing is that they are, again, not being used in the appropriate way, at least by the exercise details. They're coming, the motif has been that they come in by air assault, so helicopter landing, they try to seize a place, and then as far as we can tell, we don't have the full tactical information yet, obviously, the Russian military transport aviation basically takes off with the next wave of reinforcements to fortify that position. Like hours later, I think at that first battle of Rostomel, the VDV landed there around 1,300 hours, if I remember correctly. I have to go through my notes here. Around 1,300 hours, and then we got like the signal from all the flight radars that everything was signaling off from Pskov at 1,700 hours. That seems like just an incompetently run operation. And then on top of that, when they're going on the subsequent deployments that the VDV did, they've always been basically supplementing ground force attacks. And it's not like they're super soldiers. They're basically just competent Kontraktniki in those capacities. So I'm not terribly surprised they have underperformed, given that they just haven't been doing their core mission most of the time. And that one time that they did, they just didn't have the appropriate timing for it, it seems. I am surprised at just their inability to do the elementary amount of planning that you would have thought would have gone into an operation where they had 4 months to build into it.
And let us not forget about 2 EU-76 that they got down in the process, 2 or 3, which again is not something that we recommended in New Model Army.
Yeah, that's true.
We do recommend in the New Model Army forcing the Russians to move by helicopter in the rear. And that has been something that I've been kind of surprised that though the Ukrainians have not been able to force the Russians to do that, the Ukrainians have been very adept at taking down helicopters moving about because they're moving in echelons and easy to target. So I do think that our proposal is still a good one, but it has not played out the way that we anticipated in the report so far anyway.
Okay, guys. So I think it's a good moment to... Yeah, go ahead.
To interject, final thing is nuclear escalation that we also saw, or signaling courtesy of Russia, which again began far before the conflict, continued on Monday 3 days prior to the onset of hostilities, and then continued through Sunday and later on in a pattern that I think is predictable for us. That is Russia's signaling, sometimes more, sometimes less directly, its willingness to accept, even inadvertent escalation, basically threatening to escalate to nuclear level.
But I think we've also seen that they've clearly being limited to certain rhetoric so far. And they would never use nuclear weapons against Ukraine because why would they waste them against something that's not even part of NATO?
Absolutely.
But we've also seen this in attacking nuclear power plants, turning this into Ukraine could be building its own nuclear weapons. It's still entirely rhetorical. It gets us to pay attention to the fact that there are nuclear power plants being shelled, which is important. But it's still something that is not actually testing nuclear weapons.
No, absolutely. I mean, that they very clearly, it would be wildly out of proportion, no matter how unproportional are the threats in the first place, but of course going further would be even more so. So surely they leave themselves some leeway for the future. It's also interesting to note how the Ukrainians reacted to this, because I don't know if you remember, but I'm pretty sure you remember the reaction of Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba on Sunday. Following Putin's order to put nuclear forces. It was also interesting that Putin didn't clarify whether he meant strategic or non-strategic nuclear forces. So that was a fun fact. And it was also a fun communication with the West next day when Shoigu indicated that strategic nuclear forces rather than strategic. But that's a secondary thing. On Sunday, after Putin's proclamation, Kuleba went on record saying that he recognizes the move and it will be a tragedy for the world should the Russians use nuclear weapons, but it will not mean that Ukrainians will cease their opposition or their struggle.
They will keep fighting. So that's what he said.
That they will keep fighting, yeah. So again, those threats were not directed at Ukrainians. At the end of the day, they were still directed at the patron state, the United States. But it was still very interesting that Kuleba essentially raised the stakes, saying that even if after singular use the Ukrainians would keep fighting, so if Russians would like to retain escalation dominance, they would have to keep using nukes rendering their whole objective more and more and more. So that was also interesting, and I think that was also not far off from what we mused on in our report.
New model arm for Poland, yeah.
So in sum, I would say that we can't say that this war has purely validated all of our thoughts, but it does seem to indicate that we're definitely on the right side of both the nuclear weapons angle and the maritime angle with some certainty. The sensors, I think, are also probably something we should feel a bit more confident will function. The harassment zone, we've seen lessons that show that this is a good idea, but I don't think it's very conclusive simply because of how different the anticipated tactics are. The Russians have just been too incompetent for us to test to this point. This may change. It certainly looks like it doesn't take too much concentration force to keep a Russian fire team that just happens to be driving by itself in the middle of nowhere. But I think we could have guessed that in advance. And then investment in range, more affordable air defense definitely is a good idea. And another thing we did not discuss at length today, strike UAVs, especially in an environment where there's not going to be that much electronic warfare because the Russians are concerned about their own command and control protocols, have clearly proven to be useful because they're destroying things worth infinitely more than you might lose if they get shot down, almost on an hourly basis on some days. So those are the main takeaways I would take away. I don't know that it's clearly disproven any aspect of what we've been looking through, though I certainly agree with Jacek that the main armaments that we need to make sure are distributed inside the harassment zone are anti-tank weapons. And really, anti-tank weapons and additional sensor data. That's about all we really need for certain.
Yeah. Okay, perfect, gentlemen. It's getting late in Warsaw, almost midnight. Almost the 9th of March. We'll see what the next days will bring. Thank you, Nicholas Myers, Albert Świdziński, Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. You stay with us for more episodes to come. Thanks.
Thank you.